Welcome to the Podium Pod, the Pick and Roll's national basketball podcast as we begin the road to Paris 2024. I'm Adam Webster, and today I'm joined by Pick and Roll feature writer Jacob Doole. Jacob, welcome back to the show for the first time in 2024.
Yeah, thank you very much, and for the first time in video as well for me. I'll apologise to the viewers right now. I've always been told I've got a face for radio, so we're really putting that to the test for once and for all here.
Everyone can focus on the Paddy picture in the background, the jerseys in my background. They just need to listen to the dulcet tones. And we were just treated to a victory from the Australian Boomers, 91-58 over China. Certainly much more imposing than the first time these two teams met on Tuesday evening. However, we still have a few lingering questions ahead of final roster cuts that are expected on Friday. We'll get into that. Talk about the game first, though. Australia really struggled from the field in the first half. They shot 5 of 18 from 3. They led 38-24 at halftime, but were able to close it out with a stronger second half offensively, finishing 91-58 winners. Jacob, what did you see from that game that just occurred that either allowed you to pick a player for Paris that you hadn't necessarily picked before, or left you some concerns for some players that might be missing out?
It feels really tough. I know this is just, repeating what everyone said. There's going to be some hard cuts here because every time a player came in and made 2, 3, 4 plays and you go, wow, that might be him with his seat on the plane to Paris. Then someone else comes in who, plays a similar role and they make some plays and you go, well, maybe that's them on the plane to Paris. So it felt like every time someone checked in, they'd make something happen and you'd feel really good about their chances. So it kind of felt like the big head-to-heads coming in were maybe a few of those bench scorers, your Jack McVeighs, your Chris Goldings. Golding had a really strong game in limited minutes, knocked down a handful of threes again. McVeigh a bit quieter, but still didn't look out of place. So hard to really make too many judgments there. And I feel like the other big one was the big man stocks with Duop Reese sitting out tonight. How would Jock Landale and Will Magnay go? I think Landale's well and truly cemented his place in the main rotation for the Boomers. He was fantastic. So the question remains, has Will Magnay done enough to get that third big spot if they choose to take one?
Well, it was the Jock Landale show throughout. He led all scorers, 19 points and 9 rebounds. He also played 23 minutes. So we got a really good look at Jock Landale for the first time in an Australia Boomers uniform in quite some time. Of course, he missed the World Cup and the group stage in Okinawa, which the Boomers failed to get out of due to an injury right at the very last moment. And you refer to Will Magnay there. You've got a piece on pickandroll.com.au that just ran. And one of the points that you make in that piece is around the big man stocks of the Boomers. John Casey and Andrew Games on commentary spoke about it throughout the second half around, do you take Will Magnay to bolster those big man stocks? It's going to be a really interesting question. You, of course, have Jock Landale and Duop Reith as your first choice big men. But then you have Xavier Cooks and Will Magnay sort of waiting in the wings. You have guys like Jack McVeigh, Joe Ingles, Nick Kay, Jack White, who can all play that 4 position, and that's probably their more natural spot. So you have to decide how many of these big guys are you going to take, because you seem to have really strong stocks at that position. You could go one of many ways. Will Magnay, I'm not sure he quite did enough in the minutes that he had. He scored 3 points, had 5 rebounds today. His defensive presence was good, though, and he is a rim protector. You do need that at FIBA level. You, of course, can block the ball off the rim. There are some rules that carry the ball in your favor as a big man. So it'll be really interesting to see if Will Magnay can make this team. Of course, we can't read too much into Duop Reith missing this contest due to rest. We had Duop Reith, Matisse Thybulle, Jack White, and Dejan Vasiljevic all rested for the contest. I almost think that that's a case of Duop and Matisse kind of being on the plane to Paris, Jack and Dejan not necessarily being in that final 12. Am I onto something there? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I think I agree with that 100%. I think, yeah, if you're sitting at a game like this where Brian Goorjian has said he's going to start really drilling down into the lineups he's going to run in Paris and getting those lineups, with some continuity, I think if you're being sat out of that game, it either means you're 100% in or you're 100% out. And I think it's pretty easy to draw the distinction with that group of 4. I don't think Jack White or DJ Vasiljevic did anything necessarily wrong in camp or in the game earlier in the week. They just didn't do anything to really stand out for two guys who were already on that bubble. And
Yeah.
I think the other two players that missed, I think they're pretty safely in the main rotation, the best squad that's going to be going to Paris. So I think you're right in that. A lot of the question marks were in those players that were out on the floor tonight. And I think that's why Brian Goorjian kind of fell the way he did, because he needed to try and find some answers on the fly.
Well, Jack McVeigh cooled off a little in this game. He was 1 for 5 from 3-point range. He did add 3 assists. He was making plays happen and making the right pass on offense. It's clear that he's definitely not below the moment. He matters out there. He belongs out there in FIBA play. So I think you and I are probably in agreement that Jack's on the plane, right?
I think so. I think he showed enough in that first game and then followed it up by not looking out of place tonight. I think if he had come out and looked a bit out of his depth, missed shots, but also struggled defensively, then maybe you second guess what you saw in the first game. But yes, he didn't score the way that he did in the first game, but he worked really hard defensively, really vocal defensively. You can see him kind of making sure everyone's where they need to be and calling switches and calling picks. So he might not be, an A+ defender, but I think he does enough in the scheme of this Boomers team to hold his own at that end. So I think just the X factor he brings, the confidence he brings, the fact that he seems to have fit in really seamlessly here, I think it's hard to overlook that, really.
And then you've got a guy like Dyson Daniels. He had 9 points on 2 of 7 shooting, a couple of assists, 4 steals, which plays into his game really well. He's another guy on the bubble, though. You have these perimeter sort of defenders that are nominally 3-and-D guys, but the three's kind of missing. You've got Dyson Daniels, Josh Green in that group as well, Dante Exum to an extent in that group as well. All those guys are sort of similar skill sets in terms of their defensive prowess. It's just a matter of one of them could get hot at any point in time. You hope that one of them gets hot, but none of them really showed, the heat that Jack McVeigh did certainly in the first game. And you need these guys to be really consistent shooters at FIBA level to stretch the floor.
You do, and it's something that we saw at the World Cup last year, wasn't it? There were maybe just too many guys with overlapping skill sets. There wasn't much flexibility for Brian Goorjian in game plan or lineups because a lot of the players kind of crossed over like that. And you're right, they're far from the same players, but Exum, Green, Thibault, Daniels play a similar role. They're out there to defend, to knock down shots. I think the difference maker is, as you say, that Dante Exum brings a lot more offensively. He can knock down the three ball. We've seen that in the NBA this season. He can attack off the dribble. So I think he's a must have. Josh Green has developed into quite a good, consistent shooter, can get to the basket as well. So I think he's one that's easier to pick. You look at Thibault and Daniels, I'm not sure there's room for all 4 of those players. So that could be where a decision is to be made. And I think Thibault has shown more consistency as a jump shooter. That's where Dyson Daniels, despite potentially being the best defender of the 4 of them, I think there's an argument to be made for that. You could still see him missing out altogether here. And that's where it gets really tough because you can't pick your 12 best players on paper, even though that feels like that's what it should be sometimes.
Another battle is going to be a guy like Nick Kay, along with Xavier Cooks, Jack McVeigh, Joe Ingles, that 4 spot that we've spoken about. You can't really take all of those guys. It's going to be really hard to justify not taking your Joe Ingles, particularly with the passing that he showed in this contest. It was very best of Joe at the start of that third quarter. And it seems to be that at this later stage in his career, the power forward position is his more natural position out there at FIBA level. He can make things happen both on the perimeter and inside with that passing. He can obviously stretch the floor. He's a really deadly shooter when he gets going. So for me, it's a Nick Kay, Xavier Cooks type circumstance if Jack White is almost certainly missing.
Yeah, you're right about Ingles. It's an interesting one, him at the 4, because he kind of cited that at last year's World Cup as being a real issue and why he struggled, because he'd never played at the 4 until the tournament. He was kind of forced into it when Landale went down. So when Brian Goorjian talked about that being a learning experience, the World Cup, I think most people thought of the younger players. But for someone like Joe Ingles, that may have actually unlocked some new parts of his game going through the fire in a tournament like that in an unfamiliar position. Now he's out the other side and he maybe does have that bit of extra positional versatility. So I think you're right. His playmaking made a massive difference tonight. It opened things up for everyone else on the floor, particularly the bigs, which I think is important. So I think he's definitely shown something there and made a really good case for himself. And you could be right. Xavier Cooks, Nick Kay, again, very different players, but in that four spot can play up at the five, but only in specific matchups. It's what do you value more? Do you value the sort of savvy and smarts and experience of Nick Kay and the skill that he brings from the 3 point line, or the athleticism and bit of playmaking from Xavier Cooks? I think it's an interesting discussion either way.
We're going to have to talk about Patty Mills. He was 1 for 11 in this contest, 2 points. And this is the second game in a row that he struggled. Now, you can take it with a grain of salt. Ben Mallis and I talked about it 2 nights ago because it is a friendly, it's a warm-up game. These guys are feeling each other out and they're feeling the FIBA game out once again, particularly if they've been playing NBA basketball. They're two completely different styles. But Patty didn't get a lot of minutes in this season for Atlanta and then when he signed with Miami later in the season. So it's a little bit concerning to see that the shot's just not falling for him right now, because normally he's a starter in this group. He certainly deserves the chance to start and play big minutes, particularly given that he effectively gave us a bronze medal by himself in the Tokyo 2021 Olympics. But it's concerning that he's not getting shots.
It is, and it's funny. I feel like we were having this similar discussion ahead of the World Cup last year when he really struggled in some of the warm-up games there. And from the way the tournament went, it's hard to really say definitively whether that was cause for concern or not, because yes, he led the team in scoring, but he certainly wasn't his efficient and dynamic self throughout that tournament. There were flashes, and ultimately the team struggled offensively, even though he was the leading scorer. So it's an interesting one. It really feels like it could go either way. I think we can agree there's no doubt that Paddy is going to be on the plane to Paris, but the role that he has and how effective he is, I think there's some valid questions there, just given, as you say, the lack of consistent burn he's had on the court recently, and then the showing he's put in here. But, these warm-up games, you can't put too much stock into them. I think it'll be interesting to watch and see how he goes in Abu Dhabi against the US and Serbia, which is going to be a little bit more at tournament pace.
Well, the Podium Pod is brought to you by Team Feet. Team Feet offers premium athletic socks for modern teams, however they compete. With sweat wicking, cotton, arch support, ventilation panels, and compression stitching, Team Feet socks are built to outperform. Whether your team is tiny or thousands strong, Team Feet unites and excites your players and supporters with their combination of quality and performance. Join basketball teams around Australia and the world by choosing Team Feet. For designs and worldwide delivery, head to teamfeet.com. Jacob, I want to continue by talking about Chris Goulding. He caught fire in that third term, hit 4 3-pointers, ended up 4 of 6, 12 points in just 12 minutes in this contest. Also played reasonably well 2 nights ago in the first meeting between Australia and China. Is Goulding on the plane? Originally, it was going to be McVeigh versus Goulding. You needed to take a shooter. But the more that I look at this club and the way that the Boomers are playing and, their deficiencies on the shooting end, the more I think that you almost need to have McVeigh, Ingles, and Goulding, and you've got to have one of them out there at all times to be able to stretch the floor, because seemingly no one else can make shots.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think it's easy to look at those three and say they're too similar. You can't play them all at once, but you don't need to play them all at once. As you say, you need to have one of them out there, two of them out there, maybe at most. But I think they can all play a role in this team. And Golding's the one that feels like the most obvious to leave off if you were going to leave one off, because he does lack that versatility of the others. He can't really defend up a position. He's got plenty of criticism on that end over his career, and he is essentially just a shooter. But that's what the Boomers need. They needed more shooting at the World Cup. Brian Goorjian was very open about that before, during, and after the tournament, and yet we didn't see Chris Goulding play. So it feels like an obvious one almost, that you take him, even if he's your 12th man, that's fine. He's an X factor when the offense is struggling, which we've seen in these warm-up games, and we saw it at the World Cup. There'll be stretches where it's struggling, and Chris Goulding's come in and he's made shots and he's made a difference. He's gotten the team rolling. So I think it's easy to discount him as an easy cut in a vacuum, or in some ways, because of his lack of versatility. But you don't always need the versatility. You need someone who can make plays and play a role.
the end of the day, the winning team scores more points than the other team. So anyone that can score points in bunches like Chris Golding can is someone that you have to seriously consider. Now, I'm the host, Jacob, so I'm going to put you on the spot because I'm allowed. Who should miss if we assume that Jack White and Dejan Vasiljevic are not chosen? You have to cut 3 more. Who should miss and who will miss?
I sat for most of the second half of this game and shuffled names and tried to figure out where I landed. I think there's 3 that miss out off the bat. I think it's White, Vasiljevic, and Dellavedova. Again, I don't think Delhi's done too much wrong, but it just feels like he's one that there's less of a need for his skill set. You've got those defensive guards. You've got a lot of playmaking from different positions. So for as well as he played in the NBL this season, I think he's one that misses out. From there, I think working through it, you can lock in a good 8 players. I think Giddy, Exum, Green, Mills, Thibault, Reith, Landale. You can lock them all in. The final draft I landed on, I've got Chris Golding there as that shooter. I've got Jack McVeigh, Joe Ingles. We talked about all of them. I think you can take all 3. And then Nick Kay in that last spot at the 4. And sorry, Xavier Cooks as well. I think I left off as well. So Cooks and Kay as those forwards, which means leaving out, you've got Will Magnay. I think you can still make the argument for taking the extra 5, but
Yep.
it's a risk they're going to have to take either way. And Dyson Daniels, I had just missing out as well, just because of that skill set overlap. So it really is one that could go 20 different ways at this point, even with a handful of cuts that feel fairly easy. So I'm interested to see what everyone else thinks ahead of the cuts being made and where it lands ultimately.
I'm almost there with you. I think I've got one slight change, and I think you make a tough call. And I like Nick Kay as a player, but I'd take Will Magnay over Nick Kay because you have those players that I mentioned before that can all play the 4 position, which is Nick Kay's natural position. I think you have good coverage at that spot, and Magnay allows you to play potentially Xavier Cooks at the 4 or Duop Reith at the 4 because you have a rebounder playing. So in addition to Jack White and Dejan Vasiljevic, I would have Matthew Dellavedova missing. I would have Nick Kay missing, and I would have Dyson Daniels missing. So we're almost completely aligned in what this final squad could look like, but it's not out of our call. It's up to Brian Goorjian, and he will make that call apparently on about Friday of this week. So tomorrow, as we record this, it should come out at some point. Players will be told who's going, who's staying, who's heading to Abu Dhabi, because that's the next couple of games. As you alluded to earlier, we've got games against the USA and Serbia. Our time, it will be, It's the 16th and 17th of July, our time. So in just a little bit under 2 weeks' time, we'll see the USA and Serbia. By then, we'll also know what our group games look like, because at the moment, we only know one team that we're playing right now in Paris. We know that we'll be playing Canada, but we'll be playing 2 qualifiers. And we had a really interesting result. Be remiss if, this is a pick and roll, of course, be remiss if we didn't mention the Tall Blacks, New Zealand, defeating Croatia overnight and giving themselves a semi-final berth, which is a really impressive result for a program that, looking at the talent of that qualifying tournament, you wouldn't have necessarily expected the Tall Blacks to emerge from that, but they have a red-hot chance to do so.
Yeah, they've given themselves every chance, and it's a Tall Blacks roster that I think us in Australia would respect a lot more than most because of the NBL connections there. We see those players all the time, but they're punching above their weight on the global stage by getting a result like that, and it's really fun to see, and just highlights how much the gap's narrowing between some of these countries. We saw that result plus the Philippines knocking off Latvia as well in the Olympic qualifying tournaments. There's some fun teams out there who are really, really hungry for an Olympic berth. And I think that's going to make it interesting, both in these final games in the qualifying tournaments, and then when they get to Paris, whoever makes it, and 2 of them will come up against the Boomers. It's going to make for a really interesting challenge, playing teams that are already kind of in game mode, battle hardened and ready to go.
Well, we will be with you the whole way throughout the warm-up games and Paris 2024 on the Podium Pod. Jacob, thank you very much for joining me, as you'll be joining me throughout this tournament.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to riding along with you.
Thanks for tuning into the Podium Pod live on YouTube, of course, across our Podium Pod podcast channels, and at the Pick and Roll. pickandroll.com.au is the website you can go to read everything from Jacob and the fantastic team at the Pick and Roll. I'm Adam Webster, and we'll see you again next time.